Mike Damergis here from Iona University with Dr. Elena Procario-Foley. And Elena, to say the least, it's been a whirlwind of emotions, a real tidal wave across the world with the passing of Pope Francis.
Indeed. It's been a hard week. I've been speaking to people about it, and there are times when I just really get choked up. He was a very special pope for us.
He's been called the people's pope. He seemed like the kind of guy that you could reach out and touch, unlike maybe previous popes that seemed up on a pedestal. Is that an accurate description?
It is, and it is in very different ways for different popes. So since the mid-60s, Pope John the 23rd began to tone down all the medieval trappings of royalty. But it takes a long time. It's an ancient institution, and so he reduced some things. Pope John Paul II reduced some things. Pope Benedict brought some things back. Pope John Paul II went around the world kissing the land wherever he landed on the plane. He connected with people in huge crowds in dynamic and charismatic ways. Pope Francis does this both with one-on-one, with groups, and in what he says. So with what you said, is that an accurate statement that he's really the people's, pope? It's very true from how he approaches language and difficult topics. He speaks in everyday, often off the cuff and unscripted, which sometimes gets him in trouble, sometimes doesn't, sometimes gets his, people or advisors upset. Whereas our previous two popes, who collectively reigned for, I'm going to say 35 years, but I'd have to check the math, they were scholars in a way that they protected their speech, as I am right now, right? And Pope Francis was happy to say, who am I to judge? Pope Francis was happy to, in the manner of St. Francis, the medieval St. Francis of Assisi, and Pope Francis said this in his very important encyclical released in 2020, Fratelli Tutti, that it's not about a war of words and imposing doctrine on people. It's about spreading the gospel of love. And so he wanted to do that in every way he could.
In 2015, you covered him when he was here in the States. What struck you about his presence here in America and here in the States?
Again, really moving with the crowds. And other popes certainly have done that. Going in New York to visit with children, to schools where he just electrified the people there. And from the point of view of message, his address to the joint session of Congress was absolutely extraordinary. And he mentioned four great Americans. Two people know. Two other people probably had to Google as he mentioned them. But Abe Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and then people who aren't in kind of the Catholic orbit, Thomas Merton, great mystic of the United States, and Dorothy Day, the great champion of the poor who started the Catholic worker movement. And to this day, around the world, in New York City, there are at least two Catholic worker houses where the absolutely destitute come to their door. In Dorothy Day's autobiography, she explained that police would bring people that they found on the street that emergency rooms wouldn't take. We're talking about in the 30s and the 40s when Dorothy Day was in these houses. And so to lift up the example of these four Americans was in Congress was amazing, because he was saying, this is what you have to do. This is how you have to live.
Pope Francis has genetically Italian DNA, but his heart was that of a South American, of an Argentinian. How important was that to elect a pope from Argentina, the first time South America, and the wave of emotion that you see going on in that country and across the world? It was very important because he was also the Pope of the poor, as he's been said to be.
Yes, exactly. Well, it was one of his many firsts. The first pope from the global south, whether one wants to use that term or not, or critique that term, from a country with a difficult past. His family moved to Argentina because they were very upset with the rise of fascism in Italy at the time. So they left there, and he was born in Argentina. And he was up close and personal, again, even as he rose through the ranks of the Catholic Church, which is something he has consistently told priests should not be their goal, and he would accept an appointment as service. As he did that, he did have some, well-documented troubles, and the wonderful thing about Pope Francis is that he is very vocal about learning from his mistakes, and he, over time, developed a very different style of leadership, as I've read in a couple of autobiographies. And so as Pope, we see his leadership style and his concerns for the poor and his concerns for people and his concerns for listening to everyone, that were born out of someone learning and praying and changing to do what he says, right? Preach the gospel.
I grew up, the Pope was always considered infallible. He's apologized for transgressions of the church, and which really goes to his leadership you were talking about. That's simply incredible for a Pope to actually apologize for something.
It is, although I'd have to say he's not exactly the first who did that. And so when I speak with different groups, I do explain what infallibility means. It's very much a recent doctrine in the Roman Catholic Church, only a couple of 100 years old, and it's not that everything the Pope says is infallible. There are special conditions for speaking infallibly, but the Catholic faithful are supposed to take seriously, of course, everything that the Pope says, and with utmost seriousness. So yes, Pope Francis rescinded and apologized for something called the doctrine of discovery, a very much kind of part of the whole colonialist trajectory of Western nations. And but prior to him, Pope John Paul, at the turn of the millennium, the last Jubilee year, we are now in Pope Francis's Jubilee year of hope. And a Jubilee is biblical, coming out of the Hebrew Bible, and which then becomes part of the Christian Bible. And during the Jubilee year of 2000, in 1998, 99, 2000, Pope John Paul II repented for the sins of the Church against the Jewish people. So, and also issued a very important document called Memory and Reconciliation, which was a deeper intellectual dive into problems the Church had had over its time period. So Pope Francis builds on things like that.
If I was going to take a piece of clay and put together what a pope should be, I don't think a former bouncer, a huge soccer fan, might be some of the criteria you would have for a pope.
Yeah, but someone who likes to dance, I think.
And someone like, I mean, it's simply incredible, his past to being the pope, and his endearing quality of just being like the uncle you could reach out and touch. That persona he had was just basic one-on-one, but he did grand things too. He spoke sternly out against the war in Gaza, immigration here in the States, the way we handle immigration. He spoke out. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind.
No. In fact, a colleague of mine just wrote an article in the magazine Commonweal that exactly says he was a fearless pope. I haven't read it yet. I'm looking forward to reading it, but that caught my eye in the first paragraph. And in all things that he speaks out for or against, the central point is human dignity and human beings and the common good. And in this document that he wrote in 2020, it's such a beautiful, beautiful document. And he talks about how people today just invert and change the meanings of words like democracy and common good. and he really tried to put the world's eyes back on what those words really mean. So 3 days, I think it was, before he was hospitalized in February, he wrote a letter of support to the United States Catholic bishops. And in that letter, he specifically addressed something that one of the high-ranking politicians in the United States had tried to say was Catholic teaching about love. And the Pope said, no, this is really what the teaching of love is. It's not restricted to just your family, right? So love has to go out to everybody, and it has to bring in and be focused on the people who are most tossed aside. So he would talk a lot about the young and the old, because they have the least power, and he doesn't want the young or the old to walk alone. That's what in 2015, when he was here in the United States, he talked about not walking alone when he was addressing young people in the televised, I think it was ABC televised town hall in the week or so before he actually came to the United States. It was an extraordinary, multi-site electronic town hall. And so not to walk alone and not to abandon our elderly. And he spoke about how in COVID, the elderly were abandoned and people needlessly suffered. So when he's not afraid to speak out, and whatever he's saying is always centered on the human being, to be open to each person, to be in dialogue, like you, I think, said one-on-one. Very good about that, wants to be with people, wants to listen to them, wants to hear them, wants to get us all to know each other in our God-given uniqueness. And if someone's God-given uniqueness doesn't appear to sync with Catholic doctrine, he's like, yeah, we'll get to that. Let's talk about love. Let's talk about letting everyone have what they need to thrive in this world.
A little humility. When Syria was collapsing, the refugees went to Lesbos, a Greek island, Greek Orthodox. A lot of the refugees were probably Muslim. Some form of Catholics were there as well, Christians, and whatever faith they were, the refugees. He uplifted the refugee spirit by being there. So again, religion didn't matter, nationality didn't matter. He rose above that and brought himself down to where the refugees gave them a kind of feeling of hope, and he had that nature. So that was a very moving point. Of course, Lesbos, special to me because that's where the Greek refugees left Turkey 100 years before, almost, on that very same island. So to see that reoccur was a very moving time for the Pope, and really a moving time for the world to see something like that.
Yeah, no, that's one of many examples. And when he was on, he went to when a ship of refugees turned over and people drowned, and some made it to the island of Lampedusa. He went there and he said, I am here as a challenge to our conscience, so that this never happens again. And so definitely, as you just said, to uplift the people who had survived and to try to train the eyes of the world on the fact that, we can't let people just die on rickety boats. We have to open up the borders, let people in.
He relied on women, because when I think of, religious women, I think of Mother Teresa, Mother Cabrini and stuff like that come to mind, but a religious woman doesn't hit me in the face right away. He was pushing towards more power for the nuns and women in the Vatican.
Yeah, and he actually did some extraordinary things with that. So what some people have been writing about is that he is all about positions of decision-making in management in the Vatican and within the church more largely for women, not so much in ministry. So the question of women being ordained as permanent deacons or as priests. But again, that opens up a conversation. So where for thousands of years there were no women in leadership, in the Vatican in 2022, he rewrote the Vatican Constitution. And he had a very important phrase that any office could be filled by any baptized, member of the faithful. And there was a caveat because certain things would be restricted to priests, but it was this one paragraph really opened the door. And so then he had a series of appointments that put women in positions of leadership. Even before 2022, he had started. So in 2016, he appointed a woman as the director of the Vatican Museums. In 2019, he named 6 women to very important committees. The technical term is dicasteries, but at that point he hadn't reorganized things, so they weren't yet all dicasteries. And so they were at sort of mid-level positions, and then with the 2022 change and reorganizing and streamlining the various offices in the Vatican and issuing the statement that, any baptized could hold any office, then there were a string of other appointments, and again, just the Pope never stopped working. Even in the hospital, he was working. In January and in February, he appointed two women. The first head of a dicastery, so the other women were to mid-level positions, prior to this. But in January 2025, the first woman to head a dicastery, so she's called the prefect, and then in February, a woman became the president of the Governorate of Vatican City, the executive body of the Papal City. So these are women in extremely high positions. So he's again opening up conversations and asking people to consider possibilities. And one of the other important things that has happened very recently in the past 2 or 3 years is the Catholic Church has been in what's called a synod of synods. And a synod is usually a regularly scheduled gathering of bishops to think about a particular issue. And Pope Francis wanted a synod of synods, a multi-year process, which invited feedback in its preparatory phases, from around the world. So parishes held listening sessions, and areas of parishes got together, and people, provided input and answered questionnaires, and all of this went to the Vatican and the organizers for the synod. And what happened, right, is that the Pope had not just women, but lay men and women at the synod. And more than that, they were able to vote. So there were particular women who were allowed to vote at the synod with full voting rights, as the bishops or the priests or whoever else was allowed to vote at the synod. And that had never happened before. So he's opened doors that I think will be hard to close. I hope they'll be hard to close. And it's a process of continuing to have this conversation, to get to know, right, each person, which means get to know women.
Oh, you talk about opening doors. He talked about death is not the end of everything, but the beginning of something. How poetic. Your final thoughts here, your wealth of information here on the Pope and the Vatican and Christianity. What's next for the papacy? What kind of leader are they looking for?
That's always the big question. I would say, and I would want people to understand that, this is not a political election. Are politics involved? Sure, we're human beings, right? And so the cardinals have already started to meet. Some people need to get to know each other. There are a whole lot of new cardinals in the College of Cardinals. Pope Francis appointed many. He appointed many from parts of the world that never had cardinals before, and so now they have a voice in figuring out, electing who will be the new pope. And there's all sorts of rules and processes for that, but first we'll have the funeral on Saturday, and then the conclave the time for the conclave will be after the 9 days. Since the Pope's death, there'll be a 9-day period of mourning, including the funeral. And the cardinals get together, the voting cardinals and the non-voting cardinals, and they talk about what do we need? What do we need? So Pope Francis, as a cardinal, had given a speech, if I recall correctly, in 2005 during the decisions that ultimately elected Pope Benedict, and gave other speeches in 2013 when he was elected. And these are not campaign speeches. Each person gets up. They might have been asked a question, right? Can you speak on this issue? And so the cardinals, they have to get to know each other from different parts of the world. And it's a process of prayer. It's a process of dialogue. And if the Pope has taught his cardinals anything, it's we're not afraid of the truth. We're not afraid of history. And we cannot be afraid to dialogue with one another. And so they'll be doing that, and they will be praying. It is a process of prayer. And within the Catholic Church, the understanding is that the conclave is guided by the Holy Spirit. They are not alone. And so all of these factors will go into who ultimately is elected, and we'll see the white smoke coming from the chimney.
And you'll be on television, radio, and everywhere. It's your time to shine during these moments here.
Well, we'll see.
Thank you again for joining us. Mike Damergis and Dr. Elena Procario-Foley for Iona University.